Here on the Creative Thinker Podcast, we discuss all theories, philosophy, and thought behind the creative process. And we hope that you find some inspiration along the way.
Hello and welcome to the Creative Thinker Podcast. My name is Henry Moon and I am joined by
Michael Vasquez.
First episode of 2024, full episode. Obviously, we did the introduction. I'm so excited for this topic. Dragons, man. There's so much detail and rich history and mythology and folklore around this topic. It took us weeks to do this research, and I can't wait to share with you what we've found. But just to preface, this is going to be a part one of 2 episodes because we found so much. We're going to break it up.
Yeah, and even then, the dragon lore, there's so much lore. There's so many videos out there. There's so much research on dragons. It's crazy how much research on mythological creatures there are. But after the last episode, one of the biggest things I got requested was, hey, let's go in a little bit more detail on certain aspects. So that is absolutely what we're going to be doing right now, starting from mythology. And just an outline for today, we're going to be talking a lot more of mythology, and then part 2, we're going to be talking about dragon deities in D&D, and then we're going to dive deep and specific into black dragons. Really excited for that. We're
going to start from the cradle of life all the way down to your Dungeons and Dragons, black dragons. So it's going to be really interesting. I mean, I found the research really interesting, and hopefully you will too. So come along, buckle up. It's the month of the dragon, January 2024.
Yeah, here we go.
As we explode into dragon lore. So let me start off with what I found. We specifically did not overlap in our research so that the one and the other of us could ask questions and be involved in the hearing of it for the first time. So that hopefully we have the same questions you do in the audience.
Yeah, so a lot of this first part of the episode, I am not going to have any idea. Like, I can see our show notes, but I'm really trying hard not to look at them. And again, going to be asking a lot of questions. So hopefully you got an answer for me. And if not, we'll look it up here live.
So let me start by saying that in all the research I've done, it ranges from, say, 30 tribes all across the globe to 70 that have individual dragon-esque mythologies that are a part of their story. And in the research I've done, I want to shout out, Creganford, Creganford, Creganford on YouTube. This guy is a professor, and he does amazing amounts of research. And the videos are so dense that, man, it was a great jumping off point for me, and I have no idea what he was talking about for half of it. So it's like, there's still so many questions I have that I want to find out from his channel. So definitely shout out to him. I got a lot of stuff from there. But so scientists, professors agree on the origin of the dragon story.
Oh, really?
They feel like it's about 75% accuracy on this, where it began. The cradle of life, as they called it, in South Africa, when all the continents were connected. This was when humanity was all joined in one place, and so the story goes.
Right.
And because dragons started as serpents in most stories, they were snakes, and they were huge and lived near water. A lot of snakes, like constrictors and stuff, are big in Africa, and they do live in rainforests. They live in the water, and that is a pretty huge danger. I don't know if you know this, but roughly 180,000 people die every year now from snakes, from snake attacks.
That is wild. So those are like base form dragons,
basically.
you could call them.
Yeah, so like that's what our best guess is. So all of this, especially surrounding mythology, is like a guess at where it begins. Like, we have a lot of drawings, a lot of told by the mouth stories that weren't written down until thousands of years later. So it's a lot of guesswork to see where the tribe began, all this stuff. So it's like, they tie together things like how language morphed and which languages are like others, and sort of like a splicing of two to trace genealogy of people, basically, as well as finding artifacts and things like that. So, so they've traced this original myth back to South Africa, and so that's what they believe is like a very large snake that lives in Africa.
So like, what was the movie, like the Anaconda movie? This giant snake, that's like the first dragon.
Yeah, basically. And
then you said like sea serpents too, I guess, are dragon-esque. Is that what you're saying too?
Yes. So any
That's cool.
So the earliest iterations, I'll get into a specific one here pretty soon, but once we get into where they were called dragons instead of snakes or serpents, then they start having like other animal heads, like lions or jaguars, or like goats. I think sometimes also human hair, scales, they're always shaped like a serpent, but they definitely start gaining legs and some of the powers that you and I are used to. Which brings me to a question: when do you think? So what is the first power you think of with a dragon?
Fire breath.
Okay. Then when do you think fire breath was introduced into the dragon mythology?
Oh man. Pretty early? Mid? I have no idea.
From science's best guess, 75,000 years ago is their first iteration of a dragon story.
Okay.
Fire was added roughly 1,000 years ago.
Dang.
Roughly.
That's crazy.
Once it reached Europe is when fire was added, because Christianity was going across Europe. We'll get to this later.
Yeah.
And the merging of dragons with evil became the dragons embodying basically the devil. And then elements from hell started being added to the dragon mythology, which was fire breath.
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
That is crazy. I wouldn't have guessed. I would have thought that was something that was very soon along in the mythology. Was flying like in the mythology early on?
So it came pretty early on. Even though the serpents that were depicted didn't have wings, flying came very early on.
Okay.
So they'd be swimming through the sky and things like that. A lot of early dragons were associated with elements of weather. So wind, rain, thunderstorms, like whatever it ended up being, dragons were associated with these really big events that were difficult to explain when you don't have the weatherman on every night.
That's cool. That's cool. I like that. That's going to relate into something in a later episode, that kind of surge of environmental energy. That's cool.
Yeah. So it's going to be really interesting. I'm going to try to take you. I have 3 stories that I have prepared that will hopefully guide you through the progress of dragons. And again, this is a very greatly reduced amount of dragon lore and stories. I'm just cherry picking 3 so that I can give you a good idea of maybe how it morphed over, say, 75,000 years. So the 2 mythologies I found interesting were very much alike. So they guess 75,000 years for the South African mythology of dragons, which is called the Rainbow Serpent.
Oh, interesting.
That's a translation, of course, but it's also the same translation from native tribes in Australia, which they guess that mythology is about 10,000 years old, also called the Rainbow Serpent.
Wow.
So there are several reasons why. So picture, if you will, a drought in South Africa or Australia. You're in the desert. Food is running scarce after a difficult winter season where it's not very cold, but it is winter and there hasn't been a lot of rain, and you're hoping for a crop. A lot of these tribes were nomadic at the time, from what I understand, and they would be roaming around trying to find animals and the spring rains, essentially. So along with the dew, one morning, these tribes out in the desert see a rainbow. That rainbow often, it always means moisture, right?
Right, yeah.
It's refracted light through moisture, but that rainbow would also mean to these tribes that a pond was nearby, an oasis was nearby, the rains were coming.
Interesting.
So seeing this rainbow became the rainbow god, more or less, where it was like, this is a rainbow dragon. This serpent is bringing us life.
Okay.
So once you saw that dragon, picture a rainbow, you can see a snake in that, especially from far away, right? Especially these earlier tribes that, even the stars would be like, Orion is this archer dude. And anybody who's seen Orion, that's probably not your first thought.
Yeah, right.
But as early tribes, they're definitely ascribing meaning to a lot of things.
Gotcha.
So this rainbow serpent was one of them. The mythology that sprung up around the rainbow serpent is almost identical to the Adam and Eve story.
Oh, really?
Which is crazy. So essentially, this rainbow dragon lived inside the earth, thousands and thousands of years, and it finally woke up, chose to come to the surface, and it started looking around the world, and it was like, wow, this place is really dry. Like, just there's nothing here. There's no life. There's nothing. And it called forth the rain. The rains came day after day after day. The serpent made many revolutions around the earth as the rains came down, so much so that the oceans appeared, the rivers appeared, and as the serpent moved, it pushed mountains into the earth.
Oh, that's crazy.
And once it saw all the plant life spring up from the rain, it started calling forth animals. And it's very interesting in the mythology, they mention calling forth. They don't mention creation. They say it was called forth. And then the animals were put where they need to go.
Interesting.
So animals, birds, fish were all put in their place. And then finally, humans were called forth in an oasis. And they were given warnings about treating the animals well, treating each other well. And the warning was essentially that the snake would come back if it had to. And then after it had that interaction with the first people, it returned to the earth where it still remains to this day.
That is so interesting. That's crazy.
That's the Rainbow Serpent.
That's awesome.
75,000 and 10,000 years ago.
That's wild. That's wild. In your research of that, did you find any like correlation to like the world serpent that people talk about in like Norse mythology? Because it sounds very kind of similar. I don't know all the history of the world serpent. Was it Jormungandr? So it just sounds, some of those aspects sound pretty similar. Like it goes across the world, it creates mountains out of its movement and things like that. But
like I didn't even come up in my research, to be honest with you. I had a lot more like gargoyles and like just other mythical creatures that were branch offs of dragons, basically. Like smaller dragons. Like there was this, well, I don't remember the whole story, but there was this pope or like a Catholic church guy that basically went out to face a dragon that was burning down a village or a town or something. Everybody else had fled. He was the only one that was like, I'm going to beat this thing. And when he did, he basically tamed it. And that's why it's a gargoyle now. Like it's on all the buildings because he tamed this gargoyle, this dragon.
That's cool.
And now uses it to protect, religious things.
Interesting.
That's awesome. That was a terrible retelling of that story because I didn't have it prepared. So whatever's wrong, please forgive me.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's really cool. I like the analogy. Again, kind of moving ahead towards D&D is the analogy of how dragons are bringing life, and this rainbow serpent is bringing life into what you call the cradle of humanity. Really cool.
And that's a very interesting part of all the mythology. Is like it ranges from basically a demigod or like an angel status, something that's above humans but below gods, all the way to gods themselves.
Yeah.
So it's like a force of nature to an angel of some sort to gods. All of the mythology around dragons. It's very interesting, and it's the earlier ones are almost like the gap after the rainbow serpent. It's almost like it becomes this beast that needs to be tamed, that is neither of those things, but that's a much more modern idea of it, which gives credence to the idea that as we gained technology, we lost our fear of snakes and beasts. And so as we did, we were able to conquer that idea.
Interesting.
So anyway, that's an aside. We'll move.
That's super cool. I really enjoy that kind of creation story, and it's an interesting way to, it's a real world story, and it's an interesting way if you have dragons in your world to like it is the bringer of life, and that's why it's either worshipped or whatever. I'm thinking D&D, always D&D, of how you can put it in your world. So that is a really cool story. I really appreciate that.
Well, here's a summary of an idea that essentially, because this mirrors the creation story, essentially there's a couple lines of thought that I'm creating my own conspiracy based on a lot of stories that I read, which is that it seems as though the way we've framed the dragon story, it seems as though these are angels of some sort, and then we see that this story mirrors the creation story, but it's almost from the perspective of the snake in Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not familiar with that story, I'm sure most people are.
Mhm.
But if you're not, Adam and Eve are in this Garden of Eden where God has brought them after he's brought forth all the animals and made the earth. And then he tells them, like, they can have anything they want except for the knowledge of good and evil. And they go to this tree, they eat apples off of it because Eve wants Adam to, even though they've been told not to. And then they eat from the tree of good knowledge of good and evil after a serpent encourages Eve to do so. Basically saying that God doesn't want them to be as smart as him, as wise, and tempts them into eating of the fruit. Right? That's a bad summary, but there you go. So, this story of the Rainbow Serpent is essentially that story from the perspective of the serpent, and it's very. If you hear the full story, it's sort of, the serpent is pretty vindictive and angry sounding. It's almost like I'm giving these creatures a warning, like, you better not. And it's also taking credit for all of the creation, and it's sort of like this very braggadocious, if that's even a word, braggy sort of creation story. And it's almost like it's from the perspective of the serpent, which it takes me from the idea of, like, maybe this is our best depiction of angels to maybe this is our best depiction of one angel, which would be the devil, right?
Oh,
that's like,
interesting.
It's just an interesting thought experiment, I suppose. Like, mythologically speaking, like, if you believe in a lot of the religious texts of the day, then there was a lot of interactions between people and angels, and then maybe because these all match so closely, and there's also this very early creation myth, that perhaps there is, because dragons are mentioned in the Bible, of like the Leviathan and then the something serpent in Revelations, basically referring to the devil being defeated, that maybe it's almost like 75,000 years ago, the devil was banished from heaven and started interacting with people and told them this myth.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So anyway, that's a whole
Theory.
you could say conspiracy theory. It was just like an interesting thought experiment while I was going through my research, and so I didn't want to get through the episode without mentioning that because it's so weird.
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of these things are almost like, a lot of the mythologies are almost checked against the Bible because it's one of the better proven history documents that we have of like, this is what happened at this time. And so a lot of things are sort of held against that to see what time they occurred and what was going on at the time. So that's also interesting. Whether you believe it or not, that's the sort of one of the theories I bumped into, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure.
So again, another story, and this one in China, involving the long dragon, the yellow dragon, the black dragon, and the pearl dragon. In China, these dragons are, again, above people and below the Jade Emperor, which is the Jade Emperor is living in his heavenly palace, and these people have just had a long winter. If you know much about the Chinese culture, they have a dragon festival where they have that big paperish dragon that they dance around with and stuff, and that festival was brought on because dragon mythology of the time said that dragons came out of the ocean in spring and returned to it in fall.
Okay.
So those tumultuous times weather-wise, those were dragons. So like, if you can picture looking up at a thunderstorm when you have no idea what they are other than the fact that they rain, and you look up at the clouds and see shapes as lightning streaks across the sky, that is one of the ways that they decided that there were dragons, these big, huge weather events that they couldn't explain, that they knew brought good things for them sometimes and bad things for others. I mean, imagine living on the southeast coast of Asia and hurricanes coming up.
Yeah.
Like, you just see regular rain and then this giant hurricane comes out of the sea. And if you can see it from far away, it's just like this great big thing rising out of the ocean.
Yeah.
And how close is that shape? Small at the bottom, large at the top. and this big billowy shape that you sort of only see from the bottom. How close is that to what we picture as dragons, right?
Yeah.
So they have these big hurricanes coming in, these big storms, and visually, that's their guess of where they came from. And then there is the story of these 4 dragons: long, yellow, black, and pearl dragons. So essentially, after a drought in China, there were people that were eating bark off the trees and making like dirt cookies and things like that, trying to survive. Anything that they could put in their bodies to not feel like they were starving, they were eating.
Yeah.
And they prayed to anyone. They prayed to the Jade Emperor. They prayed to the dragons themselves. And the dragons were just flying around, and they heard these prayers. And they were calling for rain so that they could renew their crops and get back to life as they knew it. And the dragons went to the Jade Emperor, following the chain of command. Very, very good thing to do. They went and told him, hey, people are crying out. They need water. And Jade Emperor said, I'll send rain tomorrow. That's what I'll do. So the dragons left. They waited for 10 days. 10 days passed, people crying out every single day. Their need for water becoming even more great. I'm sure lots of people perishing in the meantime. 10 days without water is a long time.
Yeah.
So the dragons took it upon themselves to scoop water out of the seas and then spray it on the land. So very slowly let it out of their mouths so that it imitates rain. And so that's what they did. And the crops started to grow. The people were thankful. They prayed to the dragons, said thank you. The Jade Emperor found out about this. Obviously, the dragons did not follow the chain of command. They didn't listen to him. He had his reasons, apparently, and he asked that they be entombed under mountains. I forget the mythical creature that entombs them, but there is one.
Okay. I was about to ask that.
It calls down these 4 mountains, 1 per dragon, and entombs them under a mountain. So the mountain falls out of the sky, lands on the dragon, pushes them into the earth. And that is where they are entombed till this day. The interesting thing on top of that is that because their mouths were still full of water, presumably taking their second trip to make rain and continue these crops, was that those 4 dragons are at the mouth of China's biggest rivers. As the dragons let the water out of their mouths, the rivers were born and cut into the earth. And now these very profitable bodies of water in China were birthed by the long, yellow, black, and pearl dragons.
Dang, that is a very interesting story. What was the description of these dragons? Or because I know in different cultures, and when we talked about dragons last time, that they had different physical descriptions. What was their physical description like, if any?
My research that I did didn't really get into the physical description super much, other than to say that it was very indicative of the dragons that we see in Chinese art today. So that very sort of serpent-like with short legs, beginning and end. It's sort of like the wish dragon, right? Like they have, these big jaguar-esque heads, and like horns and scales and the whole deal.
That's cool.
So not a lot in the way of description visually. I apologize for that. I'll do that next time.
Hey, you're good.
Maybe that'll be Dragon episode 55.
Back to the beginning. That's what's up. I'm finding a theme here in these 2 dragon episodes, or 2 stories, that when dragons are introduced, they are bringing life, which I think is interesting, and that they're bringing water specifically, and how we know water is needed for life, but it's just interesting to like look at the stories of mythos and see how it is very what's the word? It's
Similar?
Not similar, needed, grounded in reality, right? This mythology of dragons, even, and again, trying to relate to a creative process of your origin story for the world. It's literally something is bringing life, and life is water, and life needs water to live,
Like a functional element of the story.
Yeah,
and then the legendary elements come at the last, basically.
Exactly, right? The functional element is they brought water. The legendary element is they brought water from the sea and are now the mouths of these rivers. But the thing, that initial thing, and it's something interesting to bring to your world, is where did the water come from? Does your world need water to live? And if we're grounded in reality, yes, but where does it come from, and how can I create water into the mythology of my world, where people are going to worship or celebrate whatever mythological being or entity or legend that brings water to your world. Again, just those two similarities were very, very interesting to me.
My ADHD is just seeing Cotton Eye Joe at this point. That's where does it come from? Where does it go?
Yeah.
Anyway,
right.
so but yes, I mean that's very true. Where it's like they did, I think it was 69 different versions of 69 questions of 30 different versions of the dragon story. And sweet. And they took whatever elements or characteristics were 75% and above, and made like a caricature of what a dragon was in these earlier myths. And it was mostly looked like a serpent that had one or two heads, one of them being a different animal than a serpent. And then they most often lived in water or were a part of water events like rain. So it was very water-based, and it was very reptile-based, which is interesting because the idea of evolution that we have, which is another rant for another time, of like, it's not a provable thing, just like history isn't, because we weren't there. But
Right.
it is, it's interesting in that reptiles were the things that came up from the primordial soup onto land. And here is this story that we have from, the close to the beginning of human history, saying that a reptile brought water onto the land.
A giant reptile brought life.
Yeah. And there's such a interesting and beautiful symmetry. And like you said, mythology is such a huge part of our lives. And the more I get into researching mythology and folklore and things, it's all these sort of unexplained phenomenon that we have, that we've made stories around to make ourselves feel comfortable and make ourselves able to cope with what's going on, which I think is so entertaining, because that's the same thing we're doing now, but it's more like, okay, well, we have this emotional event in our lives, like somebody passing away, and here's a movie about somebody having loss in their lives. It's like we can see someone else go through it. We remember that story, and from that, we glean things that we can do to get through that same event. And it's a beautiful way that we help each other without really understanding the full scope of what's going on. Anyway, it's a beautiful way to pass on advice as well. And that was another thing I found in my dragon research, was that a lot of these stories are about, like, don't go out at night. Don't,
really?
like, don't go into deep, dark caves because dragons live there. Don't go swimming in bodies of water that you don't know because dragons live there. It's a very foreboding and warning. Like, don't be out in thunderstorms. You can get struck by lightning, but it's dangerous, right? Stay away from the dragons. In much more recent years, it's been portrayed as this is the face of anxiety or evil or things like that, where it's like, what's the word? Things going wrong, basically. It's the face of everything that can go wrong. And so we have these dragons that are, like I said, basically warnings. So
Interesting.
Just another interesting thought about dragons.
Yeah, for sure.
So the Chinese dragons, I want to say were probably about 20,000 years ago, if from the top of my head. Sorry if that's wrong. A lot of these mythology stories, there's so many different versions and stuff that it's like, it's really hard to get a timeline. But this is much later, and this is a much different dragon. This is when we're talking about, like you said, physical elements, having legs, having wings, and the ability to fly, all that sort of stuff. So this is a much different dragon than the Rainbow Serpent. And then I want to fast forward a little bit more to get to a third of four dragons. The fourth one and is a much more recent dragon, so stay tuned for that. That's going to be an exciting one that I found really entertaining after all my research. I was like, this is wild. So dragons in Europe. They finally arrive, I want to say 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, something like that.
Oh, wow. That's
like
real recent.
real recent for what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
And again, pardon me if I get it wrong, but dragons in Europe were Vertra and Ingwe. Ingwe was a female dragon, and it sounds like the primary dragon. And you'll notice also, like, we went from this sort of abstract idea of Rainbow Serpent to then having types of dragons, and now we have named dragons.
Oh, cool.
In the Middle East, we have Tiamat, which I didn't really get into because the story of Tiamat is huge. It's huge. So that would take probably a part 1 and part 2 all on its own. So I left that alone, but that's another named dragon that's sort of in the area. But there was a warrior named Trito that Ingwe was stealing cattle from his village. And it became so persistent that they elected this warrior named Trito to go back and get their cattle, like send him with a few spears. That was apparently his weapon of choice, and he needs to go slay this dragon and get our cattle back.
Okay.
So they sent him off on his own, which is pretty terrible in itself. Here's this beast that everybody's afraid of. We're going to send one person. So Trito goes up to this cave in the mountains, and he finds Ingwe and the cattle. He waits for Ingwe to go to sleep, and he throws his first spear into the first head of Ingwe. Ingwe has 2 heads.
Okay.
And injures it terribly. It has enough of a difficult time moving around, just having 2 heads, but because one is injured, that one obviously sort of dangling there. And in the shuffle, he's able to get another spear throw in, and he gets the other head of the snake. Snake goes back to the back of the cave. Ingwe declares victory at this point, takes the cattle, and goes back to the village.
Ingwe or Trito?
Trito, apologies. Trito declares victory, gathers up the cattle, goes back to the village where he is celebrated. The interesting thing about this story is archaeologists found a cave with 2 giant serpent heads in 2 different rooms in the cave, ceremoniously cut off and put in these back 2 caves.
That's crazy.
So the idea behind Trito is that archaeologists think that this one might actually have happened.
Yeah.
So, which gives credence to the idea that maybe all of these did in some way or another.
So do they think that there is a dragon-like creature, or do they think that there was like 2 giant reptilian heads or 2 like bodies, and there ended up being 2 heads?
So people being people, they assign things to what they know.
Yeah.
And it says 2 giant snake heads.
Okay.
But it was up in the mountains, not where those types of snakes normally are, and it was in caves in a way that they would not have naturally occurred.
Okay.
So it was ceremoniously killed around the time of this story, this mythology.
That is cool.
Yeah.
That is super cool.
Right. Yeah. And like even the angels idea is like, it's a super cool idea. We don't have any proof of it, of course, but it's such an interesting mythology, such an interesting idea.
Yeah.
So that is Ingwe and Trito.
I like that too. Like there's also like, yes, the things that happened, the ceremonial beheading of 2 snake heads, and then Trito coming back and either glorifying or kind of saying it was more than what actually happened. So I still have the idea like, okay, what we know, like dragons aren't real. So was it these 2 giant serpentine reptilian creatures? And were the cattle being stolen? Were they 2 different creatures? But he went up and it was dark, right? And you know what? We're scared of the dark, and sometimes our mind plays tricks on us in the dark where we think we see things. And he was in fact fighting 2 different heads or 2 different creatures, and then was able to cut them off, not necessarily caring where the bodies were connected, or maybe they were like a and I don't know how often this happens, but like what is it? What is it, king's rat or rat king, rat crown, something like that, when like rats get so populated in an area that their tails get stuck together, so they form what is called like a rat king, I think.
Gotcha.
And all these rats
interesting. I've never heard that.
All these rats end up dying, right? Because they're all trying to go push in different directions. Like how would it be if these 2 giant snakes ended up getting like curled up together, whether they were trying to eat something, eat the cattle, or whatever the case is? What if one of them was dead already? I don't know. There's just so many like, oh, what if? But then he comes back and he says, Trito comes back and is like, just slayed a dragon ceremony. Here are the heads, and this is where they're at. You could go and look and verify, and sure enough, there's these two heads there.
Yeah.
That's so wild
Exactly.
to me.
And the idea that 70 different tribes around the same time came up with the exact same idea of dragons based off of things that they didn't understand. It's almost like this idea of dragons is inherently in us, because as soon as we see something we don't necessarily understand,
Mm-hmm.
we ascribe dragon to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
Like I said, they traced it back, they think, to a common tribe in South Africa, but still, to say that over 75,000 years this idea lived on, this story was retold so often and so interestingly that we're still talking about it now, like, that is nuts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it almost sounds impossible, like, so. But it is something that people imagine once they don't understand things, which will be part of the next story. But before we get to that one, when you think of a dragon story, what do you think of? Like, what are the elements of like a story? If you picked it up and it's like, this is a fantasy story, there's a dragon in it, but it's not the main character. Like, what are we gonna see? Like, what are the main elements of the story?
I mean, at this point now, I think of dragons post Europe. So I think dragon horde, dragons taking something from a village. Someone has to go and fight the dragon and slay the dragon, kind of like Trito did. And it's a fire breathing flying dragon. Like those are kind of the elements that I ascribe to a dragon story just off the top of my head.
Nice. I like that. Okay. So what I want to add to that is a lot of, let's say, late 1800s or 1900s stuff that had dragons. It was like a knight rescuing a maiden. And that sort of started in Europe.
Yeah.
And the reason for that,
the good old Shrek story.
Translating, yes, exactly, the Shrek story, exactly. So the reason for that story is, we believe, that cattle was mistranslated so many times that it went from cattle being stolen to women being stolen.
Oh, what?
That's literally what they believe to be the reason that knight going to rescue a woman is now the main story. Like knights going and killing a dragon and coming back to be indicted or included in the knight group of people. Inducted is the word I'm looking for. Inducted as a knight has been a story for forever, but them rescuing a maiden was something that happened because they mistranslated cattle, which is crazy.
That would be crazy. That would be really, really crazy.
It's super interesting.
Yeah. No, as soon as you said that, I'm like, oh yeah, that's another aspect of typical dragon stories.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And some other elements of the story in Europe that I found interesting is that with Christianity sweeping across Europe, the dragon changed quite a bit in their mythology, or their, not etymology. That's the
like their
word.
physiology.
Motif. I think the motif changed was that when Christianity merged, we already talked about adding fire, but it also made the dragons evil. So a lot of the earlier stories, it was like you had maybe like a 70-30 shot of them being good versus evil.
Yeah.
From what I saw, that's not an exact number. Don't at me, but
yeah.
You had a good chance of them being good characters in their mythology. And then along with the sweeping of Christianity, it became like, this is a pagan thought or myth. And so now this dragon merged with evil, and suddenly it was the idea of lust, the idea of covetousness. Like, they're sweeping up all this gold, they're greedy. And then there was also, in the earlier stories that were written, super gross, but it's like it was a virgin that they stole, and it was obvious. I don't forget what I was going to say, but it was a very sexualized story. So it was like the dragon takes away the maiden's virginity,
Okay.
and then it was added fire breathing because of hell, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So,
dang. So it was really a big twist. I mean, talking about the European dragon, that kind of makes sense, where Christianity came in and turned that mythology, twisted that mythology, because you just hear just what we've been talking about. Older stories, these dragons are creating life and still threatening, be like, listen, or something's going to happen, which we also see. And I feel like a little bit in Christianity, like, hey, follow these commandments, do these, or else something's gonna happen, right? Consequences to your actions. Um, but it's interesting to see these dragons go from life bringers to being evil as uh the more recent dragons come in, and as people interact with these mythologies and try and change those mythologies. Very
And
interesting.
and in the idea of evolution, it's like we start off being afraid of snakes. This is the theory. We started off being afraid of snakes, and then it became a warning about going outside, and then it was like we're afraid of drought and losing crops as we advanced, and then it became, we're afraid of guilt and shame, and suddenly the dragons are that, right?
Oh, interesting.
That
Yeah.
it's just like whatever the greatest fear of humanity is, dragons morph into,
Okay. Yeah.
which is anyway another mind-blowing thought
Yeah.
about how they progress, which is just super interesting, super interesting.
Mm.
Which brings us to 19, I don't know what year, 19 something, World War II,
Okay.
in Japan.
So 30s, 40s.
I think it's like
Oh, well,
late
40s.
40s.
Yeah, because of this. Yeah.
Yeah, so the World War II is going on, it's dragging on, and Japan is fighting the U.S. in the Philippines. Progress is slow. Both sides are losing tons and tons of people. It's not worth continuing the war. Like, the longer it goes, the less people either side is going to have, because they're losing, 5 to 10,000 a day, I think it was, there towards the end, because I think it was Japanese side started doing suicide bombings with planes, where they just fly planes into the decks of ships to sink them and stuff like that.
Kamikazes.
Yeah, kamikazes. And so they, it was just brutal fighting. There was no way to not die in this fight. Like, and so the U.S. was developing an atomic bomb, and in the South Pacific, and finally decided that to end the brutality of the fighting in the Philippines, and to get revenge in some respects for Pearl Harbor, they dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They also, this is the part most people know, right? So that was obviously devastating to those two areas. So many people died. Tragic, terrible. But around that time, I guess a little bit earlier, the U.S. was doing nuclear testing on the Bikini Atoll of the South Pacific, in the South Pacific. So
what is that? Where is that?
It's like a little island. So it's a location. So
Gotcha.
that's where they were testing nuclear bombs. And some 70 miles away, 80 miles away, was a fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon 5.
Okay.
So everybody, 23 people on that crew, got irradiated and died.
Jeez.
They were 70, 80 miles away.
Yeah.
Unintended consequence, and a ship in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, that made the news and the communal psyche of Japan at the time. So all of those events strung together became this idea of nuclear testing, creating the nuclear idea in general, creating this beast. A lot of people have referred to it as Japan's version of the U.S. A lot of people have referred to it as the anger of the world coming back on people. But long story short, Godzilla was created from these series of events. And Godzilla is this large, ancient reptilian beast that lived in the earth and then came up and is causing that or reaping that revenge of the serpent on the world for not listening to being kind to each other.
Oh, damn.
Or being kind to animals.
Yeah.
So again, this is like the loop on the Rainbow Serpent.
Yeah.
We created 70 years ago, something like that, a newer version of our dragon, which is huge, by the way, all over the world. I don't think historians, when they look back on today, will be able to avoid that Godzilla existed in our time, in our way. And it closes a loop on, the serpent rising up from the earth again and reaping its destruction when we have thrown away the lives of millions of people at that point, World War I, World War II, on a scale that the world had never seen before. So just so interesting, as well as seeing something like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, that just seeing what that did to the country and the people who live there must be so far beyond what the human psyche is capable of doing that, again, it reverts to this idea of a dragon and Godzilla is born. So they're always tied to cataclysms that pass our understanding and major natural events. So I imagine tsunamis and all that stuff. So,
and I would be remiss to not point out Godzilla. When you asked if it was a dragon last time, I was like, it's a kaiju. I think it still fits a lot of the descriptions of a dragon when we're talking about it. Reptilian beast, has a breath weapon. It's got scales. It's got fins. It's got horns. Each iteration of Godzilla is a little bit different. So I know someone's gonna be like, Godzilla's not a dragon. Well, I mean, kind of, yeah, kind of no. Like, it definitely fits the description of dragon, and especially when you're talking about like the theme and the motif, like having to come back around to that rainbow dragon and literally being that loop of like, this was what I told you. I told you to be good and kind to people, and this is the consequence. And here is me, like you said, coming out of the ocean. Oh, I think that's a beautiful, I want to say metaphor of the response, or beautiful, picture of, the destruction that we as humanity have caused, if that makes sense. My train of thought is like, that's wild. It's so cool.
Yeah, I think I sat there when I was researching. I sat there for like 30 minutes. When I was done, I was like, whoa. Like that mind grenade just went off. But I think you're right. It is in its own universe, or how it's referred to as a kaiju. And you won't, I don't think, find that line drawn. I didn't find it anywhere in my research. That was me editorializing to say, again, like you said, that is the motif of the dragon.
Yeah.
And that is our most recent iteration. And looking back on all this history, say 75,000 years ago to now, what will they think in 75,000 years? I think that would get lumped in with dragons, but that's my own assumption. So yeah, I mean, definitely in its own mythology, kaiju. But I think in this series of thoughts, that was the thing that I found most beautiful. So I'm throwing it in.
Yeah, for sure. I can't even, like, could you imagine Godzilla coming up and you see it, whatever size that it is, you're like, this is death incarnate. This is a absolute monstrosity that is coming to our home. And you would absolutely believe that is a deity, or that is some demigod or something, or some type of angel of destruction or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. I can't. Yeah, that would be nuts. I don't even want to think about it.
I'm gonna. I have a hard time, seeing people who are 7 foot tall. You're like, damn, how are you?
Right? Yeah,
a person, let alone a Godzilla.
How are you standing? Yeah.
I know
only 7 feet. Yeah,
I know, right? So I know we're kind of getting towards the end of our episode. I just wanted to hit on a couple of the mythologies. Like, what at one point did you, or in your research, did we start seeing the dragons we see today, like Game of Thrones dragons, wyvern, and some of the other dragons that are talked about, and like Aragon and some of those other stories? When did that mythology start coming in, where the dragon has 4 legs and 2 wings? Or was that actually in mythology, or was that just people taking the creative freedom of what a dragon is, or these large reptilian creatures, and making it their own in literature?
J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah,
Lord of the Rings, man. Yeah.
Okay.
So he took a lot from European dragons.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, he made it his own, and it made it into what it is today. I mean, like, anything that happened after the Lord of the Rings, and that's why everybody talks about it, and it's such a big deal, right? Like, it changed mythology for humanity.
That's wild.
Absolutely reshaped it. And so, it's based off a lot of things, but that sort of quintessential, now we see it as distilled into what dragons are in our minds now. 100% J.R.R. Tolkien.
Okay, cool.
So his book, thank you for bringing that up. His book is the transition between all of the mythology we just talked about, and so much we didn't, to Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, yeah,
So
for
that was
sure.
the Crucible.
I know we touched on it when we talked about our the last dragon episode. So okay, that's cool, super cool, super interesting. That is a ton of mythology, and of course, as we continue on with Dragon Talk, um, there is going to be more mythology. There's going to be more things that we don't hit on, and obviously, we would love to hear your feedback on if there's something else you wanted us to talk about, a different type of mythology. Like I brought up, Jormungandr. That might be something that we can talk about at a different point. Um, so if there's something that you're interested, the listener, please definitely reach out to us and say like, hey, what about this mythology? What about that mythology? So it's fun for us, even if it's not dragon stuff. Different types of. I was thinking something while you were talking about dragon mythology and just how uh, each every group of people has a different mythology and they have a different kind of big beast that might not be the dragon.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to be talking about the mythology of like elves and dwarves here in a week or two. I'm not sure when that lands, but um, any mythology is super cool and it has its own elements. It almost has its own origin story, its own creation myth. Every single one, and it seems like, at least as far as I've gotten so far, and it's very, very interesting, and it completely, every one that I research, I feel like completely changes my perspective of humanity and life, and it's really enriching to dive into. So hopefully this is a good stepping stone for you guys, and definitely, hit us up with what you want us to research, but also, if you can support the channel in any way you see fit, there's always a support button. We appreciate it. Took so much time to bring this to you, and this is only part 1 of part 2.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Before we go today, this is a fan favorite.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing our inspirations on this episode instead of part 2, so we can get into, part 2, if you can even imagine it, is even more dense than what we went through today. Let's do our inspiration. Michael, what has been inspiring you this week?
So I've been music, man. Music is always inspiring to me. So I have been listening to a group or a channel on YouTube called the Grizzly Project, and specifically their Attack on Titan project music that they've been putting out. So they put a full orchestra together and started to make some of the music or recreate some of the music in Attack on Titan, and it is just beautifully done. Listening to that music, I've been listening to it almost every day, because it just goes through a whole flow of emotions. And I think it's like 4 or 5 different songs. And the Grizzly Project, they just put out a lot of really good orchestral music from anime shows, and they're kind of struggling with some stuff as far as like Kickstarter things and getting their videos taken down or demonetized. So whatever love you can show them as well, just listening to it, I'm sure it does a lot for them. Of course, liking, subscribing their stuff, just like here. And but that has been what's been inspiring me. I actually ran one of the songs on repeat for a session that I did with my wife for our D&D session to prep for the last one that we did. And I used a Gargantua in Bigby's, in the most recent D&D giant book that they put out. There's this giant monster that's more of an abomination than a giant, and it's got these crazy horns, and it's supposed to be like 60 feet tall, and I had it with the music climbing on all 4 legs. There's some monsters in Attack on Titan that kind of do that kind of climbing motion and like flicking people away. It had a teleportation ability that could move around, so it was a very dangerous encounter, and I wanted it to feel like in Attack on Titan when the Titans broke the wall and you're like, oh, what's going on? What's happening? I wanted it to feel like this panic, and using that music really, I think, hit the nail on the head for that, because Molly was like, I don't know what to do. Like, she's trying to go through her list of things to do, and this creature was really trying to give her a very tough time. So that's been my inspiration. I really have been listening to that anytime I've started podcast prep or my D&D prep for the day. I'll be listening to that music kind of on repeat, which gives you a vibe of how my sessions are going to be run.
Very intense.
Yeah. So that's been my inspiration. Henry, what has been inspiring you? First inspiration of 2024.
Oh man, yeah, it's so much pressure. especially after, I mean, like I feel like it's so much pressure just with all the prep I did. It's like I got to get this right, and then now I got to do my first inspiration of the year. Like, okay, uh, pressure is on. So my first inspiration of 2024, like I've taken the break as another sort of renewal in my life away from technology. And so part of that is removing myself from spending as much time on social media.
Mm.
And because, like, at my current job, I have a lot of time where I have to be on my phone anyway. It's like I'm waiting for a response. So I do something. So I jump on Instagram, scroll a couple pictures, and I go back. And then I get the response from, from whoever. But um, it's like, dude, the more time I spend on my phone, the more depressed I am. And I
Dude,
started
for real.
started looking around at other things in my life that were newer technologies, like Spotify is so easy, and I love Spotify, but at the same time, it makes it so easy that I forget to listen to bands that I like. I don't take the time to listen to full albums. I don't
Mhm.
really take the time to go through, what used to be a full highly curated emotional experience that they wanted for each album. It was like
Yeah.
they would hit on a certain, motif, or it would hit on a certain theme or something that made you feel something. By that last song, you'd be like,
Mhm.
the curtain's closing, and it's just this beautiful thing. So
Yeah.
I've put effort into re-experiencing old art forms.
Mhm.
So like I got a record player, and like a good one,
Yeah.
and some speakers and stuff. And we'll, when my wife and I are cooking, um, or cleaning, whatever, then I'll put on an album in that way.
Yeah.
And it something about it, like the ritual of doing that, and then going through the ritual of cooking. Like Gracie always like is huge on cooking from scratch, so it's like she
Mhm.
makes her own sourdough and her own breads and brown sugar and vanilla, and like everything she can make from scratch, she'll
Yeah.
make from
Yeah.
scratch. And so participating in that in a small way by helping cook, um, and having on a vinyl is so much different than just putting on Spotify on the speaker or whatever. So
Mhm.
um, I don't know. There's something about it that includes patience, includes an end time, which
Mhm.
is also an amazing thing for some reason. I don't know what that is, but it's like just knowing that it's going to be 25 minutes before I have to flip the record, or 30 or something.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. Something about that is so comforting
Mhm.
versus just putting on Spotify and like, yeah, it's probably going to go till I'm dead. I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah. Heard.
never hear the same song twice. And so just going through all of that, and then I've sort of been playing games again, like older games and board games and stuff, and just going through the process of, especially with board games, setting up the game, taking
Mhm.
down the game. It's such a rehearsal, and it's such a, I don't know, anytime you create an automated series of movements for your body, then you get more confidence from completing those well. So like if I have a board game like Catan Starfarer is one of my favorites. And so
Mhm.
if I set up that game the first time and it took me 45 minutes to set up, because I was new to it and I didn't know where things went.
Yeah.
And then the next time it only takes me 30 minutes. The next time it takes me like 5. Um, that progress gives me confidence and helps me feel better about myself and my life.
Mhm.
And we're missing that with all the convenience we have in our lives. And so the more I feel like I add, like I take down the studio when we're done filming now, and I
Mhm.
put it back up beforehand.
Yeah.
And it used to take me all day to set up because there were so many cords and stuff, everything running everywhere.
Yeah.
And now it takes an hour and a half, maybe 2.
Mhm.
And just the practice of life, the preparation of life, the reason you take things seriously is because they take so much effort and time.
Mhm.
And when you take that away, we have what we have now, in my opinion, which is like everybody wants to be an influencer, but nobody wants to do any work that it takes to build a following.
Yeah.
And that's like the bane of our society. So I'm trying to move
Mhm.
away from that personally, and that's it's been working. It's been changing my opinion of life, and really making me feel a lot better. So
What's up?
that's what's been inspiring me this week.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like that. I one of the things that you hit on as far as albums, that is probably the biggest bummer is when I find a new song and it's just like a single. I'm like, dang, I really want to listen to a
Dude.
full album of this music. Because that was such an experience, like you said. Like I think someone I was listening to something, a while back, a couple of years ago, and they were like, I don't want you to just listen to this one song, one of the artists talking. It's like, I want you to listen to the album because that's supposed to make you go through the range of experiences to make this song be even better and be experienced in the way that we want you to experience it. So that's one thing I truly try to do now is whenever I hear a song, I go to the artist, I go to the album, and I try and listen to the full album. Even if I liked one song in particular, I'll put that one in my playlist. But then every now and then I'm like, I want to listen to the whole album.
Yeah,
You might find something else you like.
That's what I really liked about old Lecrae and old NF CDs.
Mm-hmm.
Like they would always, they'd have a story from end to end. It's like you had to hear everything in context, and it was like, ooh, that makes like all the songs work, but it's like you hear it in context if it hits way harder.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the experience. That's the inspiration.
Yeah.
This week, thank you for coming for our part 1 talk covering dragon mythology. Come back for part 2.
First episode, 2024. Let us know what you think about it, and we'll see you in part 2.
Thanks, everybody, wherever you are, creative thinkers around the globe. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.